following stories tell the tale of 3 sadistic killers who actually ate their victims. We have a German man who grew up as an outcast and found pleasure in the control of killing others, a woman who killed other women and turned their bodies into soap, and finally...
For 3 decades, a relentless serial killer was targeting women across the industrial heartland of West Germany. Between 1955 and 1976, he confessed to killing at least 14 victims, the youngest of them a 4-year-old girl.
This is the dark story of a man referred to as the German boogeyman. Joachim Kroll was a truly bizarre, sick, and twisted man. After being caught by the police, he posed in a series of reconstruction pictures in which he showed how he killed his victims. These images are absolutely chilling.
In my view, Kroll is among the most depraved serial killers we've seen in Europe in the 20th century.
Germany was absolutely terrorized by this horrific serial killer for 21 years. The youngest victim was that of Marianne Ketter, who was just 4 years old. Her body was found in the summer of 1976. She had been dismembered. Marianne Ketter lived on the very same street as Joachim.
Police were knocking on doors, searching for the missing 4-year-old girl in July 1976, when they made a gruesome discovery.
The whole thing was only discovered because Achim took a girl from the neighborhood. Before that, he would travel further, and the crime scenes were far away from Duisburg. That is the reason why it took us so long to catch him.
When a girl that young goes missing, it sends panic throughout the community. So of course the police were under great pressure to not only find her, but capture whoever had taken her. Unfortunately, we know that this story does not have a happy ending. Ultimately, the police would end up entering Joachim's flat, and what they discovered there was nothing short of horrific. But first, let's take a look back at this man's life and try to understand how he got to this point. Joachim was born on April 17th of 1933 and was the 6th of 9 children. He and his large family originally lived in Far East Germany until World War II caused them to move.
Joachim Kroll was the son of a coal miner, born in East Germany, weakly, unprepossessing child. Barely intelligent. He had an IQ of 79.
His family didn't have that much money, and their home was always very cramped. His family life was not good, and he was not close to any of his family members, not even his parents. Neither of his parents were very loving.
He was withdrawn and shy. He was afraid to even speak because he was physically abused.
He was a bit of a victim, a bit of an outcast, even within his own family. And then when he went to school, he didn't really fit in there either.
Germany was in a terrible state at this point in time, as the Red Army was taking over. The Kroll family had to move again and again to try and find refuge from all of the violence and killing.
Kroll had to watch women being raped, people being killed, how small boys played with explosives and blew themselves up in the process. So, as a young man, Joachim Kroll had already been badly traumatized.
It didn't matter where Joachim was or who he was with, he was not treated well. He was constantly being bullied and teased, even by his own family. He would even get in regularly.
He's quite isolated, and he's somebody who is becoming increasingly introverted, and that's always a dangerous thing.
When he was younger, he spent a lot of time working on the farm. It seemed as if among the animals was the only place he could truly fit in. There were some women who worked on the farm, and he would make inappropriate passes towards them. His approach with women was aggressive and off-putting, resulting in him getting rejected time and time again.
During his time on the farm, Kroll also developed a morbid fascination with the butchery of animals.
He wasn't repulsed by these scenes of gore and blood and violence that other people might be.
The first time Joachim saw a pig being slaughtered, it had a huge impact on him. He began sweating and his heart was racing. To him, it was a very enjoyable experience. He was overwhelmed by these unexpected feelings.
So he's a bit different, and he's developing a tolerance to violence and to death.
To make matters even more disgusting, he actually started having intimate related fantasies in connection to the killing of animals, which led him to do some pretty unspeakable things to some of the animals on the farm.
There he experienced these sexual things which aroused him, the warm blood, and where he satisfied himself. Then afterwards he lived out his fantasies on the animals with sexual acts, with cows and anything that was available.
When you look at Joachim's life at this point, you can kind of get an idea about how certain life events might have influenced the way that he looked at intercourse. He looked at it as having power, something he never really had in his life. It's new, and he really likes it.
It's the first time, I think, in his life that he's got control over what's going on.
His fantasies are getting more and more horrific and disgusting. It even got to the point that he killed a cat with a hammer and then skinned it all because he wanted to see what it looked like inside. He cut the cat open and examined the intestines in order to satisfy his curiosity. Obviously, this is already pretty horrific, but trust me, it gets even weirder when he decides to move on to blow up dolls.
Because Kroll didn't manage to get access to women, he procured himself several rubber dolls instead, which he draped with clothing.
It's not long after this point that Joachim's perverse fantasies would lead him to kill. But instead of analyzing each and every one of these gruesome murders, let's just take a look several decades down the road when he was arrested for the murder of 4-year-old Marion Ketter. His interactions with the police were extremely interesting. Police had a really hard time communicating with him or even coming up with some sort of reason for why he would do such a horrific thing. They believed that some sexual motive must have played a role.
Well, we just simply thought if someone does something like this, other things or fantasies must have played a part.
Kroll was so withdrawn, the police decided to just have one detective speak to him at a time. This way he could try to gain some sort of trust with him, and he may be more likely to open up and start spilling the details.
I said to our boss I would like to talk to Akim alone. So the two of us sat down in the interview room and I tried, with absolute mundane and trivial subjects, to get through to him.
At some point, there was a kind of shift in Joachim. He realized that someone was actually listening to him and asking questions. Someone was interested in what he had to say. This was not something he was used to at all. It had never happened before. Finally, he was ready to talk to the police. But at this point, one thing is important to note. Police don't know yet that this person is behind the murder of 14 people. All they know about so far is that he was behind the murder of Marion. So you can imagine the shock level they are about to have.
They had no idea that the quiet man sitting before them was responsible for the barbaric killing of at least 14 people over the past 21 years. His confession would stun the whole of West Germany.
The detectives who worked most closely on this case did an excellent job with a very difficult task. They managed to gain his trust completely. If they hadn't been able to do this, then there is a very good chance that he never would have confessed to all those other murders. We might still not know today who killed all those people if it wasn't for the incredibly meticulous detective work.
But just as a human being, and that's exactly how I'll treat you. Let yourself go, do that. And Kroll did that. And then day after day, he confessed to new murders.
His first murder was committed when he was only 21 years old. His mother had died just a few weeks earlier, and the year was 1955. His mother was really the only person in his life who he truly cared about. Her death sent him into a tailspin. Now, all he had was his father, who was hitting him all of the time. He had no other positive people in his life.
The victim was 19-year-old Irmgard Striel. Kroll had attacked her in the town of Ludinghausen.
Irmgard was just 19 years old at the time of her murder. He raped her, stabbed her, and then dismembered her body. Why did he choose her? Because she rejected him.
So he sees this woman and he tries to make a pass at her, to grab her and kiss her. And understandably, she doesn't react well to this.
That rejection stunned him so much that he thought, I'm a human being and I want to live my sexuality, so I have to find another way. And so violence was the only solution.
Ultimately, the way he did it was by dragging her off to the woods. When he finished with her was when he mutilated her body. It's hard to imagine killing someone, let alone doing horrific things to their corpse. This just further points to the conclusion that this is an individual that didn't have compassion or empathy. He doesn't have the emotional components that make someone a human being.
The only way that he's felt powerful and that he's felt in control is when he's been killing animals on the farm. So when he kills his first victim, this is another exercise of power. It's another exercise of control. But what's particularly important about this one is that he's crossed a line. He's killed a human being. He's killed an individual. And I think this is a line that he will cross time and time again.
He recalled that many of his victims he had strangled, and all but one was female. When you look at a picture of him, you would probably say that he looks as much like a serial killer as you would expect. With his beady eyes and weasel-like face, he looks like a creep.
The sort of chap you probably would have wanted to cross the street to avoid.
When he was first interrogated, Joachim would talk about how he sometimes would actually go as far as eating his victims. This horrific claim earned him the title of the Duisburg Cannibal.
Because he regularly boasted in the wake of his capture that he ate the victims. He said it was the only meat he could eat.
Now, at that time, there were wild stories being published in the media, and a lot of them weren't true. Some of the rumors that were going on said that police actually bribed Joachim with sweets and other desserts to confess the murders. Police claim that's not what really went down, although they did provide him with cake at some points.
This is, of course, total nonsense. I just asked him, what would you like to eat? Which is quite normal. He would say, I would like a piece of cake. Then, of course, we would go and get cake. But that was just about being human.
You can imagine what the public may have thought. This is an incredibly sick and twisted man. He is a serial killer who lived among society for over 20 years. Police finally have him in custody, and now he's getting to enjoy things like cake? It doesn't really make sense, but the police knew what they were doing all along.
In the end, it was also just a tactic to get Carl to talk. And using these means has to be allowed.
The more the police talk to Joachim, the more they realize how truly sick and depraved he really is. He explains how after he killed his victims, their bodies no longer interested him in any way, so he would just leave them behind. He didn't even bother to cover them up. He would just go about his business as if everything was completely normal.
Kroll tended to minimize his behavior, and as criminologists we call this techniques of neutralization. So rather than describing them as the horrendous things they are, he described them as his funny feelings, you know, something that was a bit of a quirk, something that was a bit odd. So he's minimizing what he's doing by describing it in that way.
He would end up confessing to at least 14 people. And he even offered to take them. He would just go about his business as if everything was completely normal. Reenactment photos were taken. Those creepy photographs we talked about in the very beginning. There are quite a few of them. This may have seemed like a very odd thing for the police to do, but they had a very good reason for doing so.
We as interrogators had no files, nothing at all. We drove behind them. They stopped somewhere. Then Achim got out and we asked, Achim, have you been here before? And if he recognized something, then he said, yes, I have been here before. He then looked at it all and went with us into the forest, depending on what crime scene it was. He then could describe how it had looked at that time. That was incredible. He had a photographic memory.
This was beyond just being able to recognize a certain area of the woods. He could remember and picture it exactly as it looked at the time he committed there many years ago. He could even remember the small details like certain trees or shrubbery. One of the places that he took the police was about a half hour away from his home. It was there that he raped and killed a 61-year-old woman named Maria Hetgen.
He saw the old lady, whom he immediately addressed and said, do you want to have sex with me? She did not want to, of course. He snatched her and pulled her into a wooded area, and then he her there.
It didn't matter that this lady was old or that she didn't possibly fit the beauty standards some would have. This is because, unlike other killers, he wasn't looking for any specific mold when it came to his victims. He was an opportunistic killer, so he just wanted to kill whenever he got the chance to. Now, his confessions affected a lot of people. Not only did the families of the victims now have some sort of closure, but there were actually men who were wrongfully imprisoned after being accused of the crimes that Joachim had committed. They were innocent men who didn't deserve to be in jail. These confessions meant that they could finally be free.
One of these victims was 13-year-old Jutta Rahn. Kroll had strangled and killed her in the town of Breitscheid in 1970, 6 years before his arrest. But in a time before DNA evidence existed, the police had focused their investigation on Jutta's boyfriend.
The police believed that they had the right person, the person who committed this crime, so they didn't continue to look for other potential suspects.
This was the first story where we then said, hey, we have somebody here who is in the know. We're not here with somebody who is not quite so clever. He wants to show us what he's done. And now we have a crime for which someone else has almost been sentenced. And he has another 20 to 30 people that he might have killed.
Jutta's boyfriend would have been no more than a child when all of this first happened. First, his girlfriend is killed, and then he's blamed for her murder after having nothing to do with it at all. He could have spent the rest of his life in prison had Joachim not confessed. It was that dire of a situation for that boy. Luckily though, through blood testing, it was confirmed that her boyfriend was not the killer, and he was released. But there were still other people out there who were likely wrongfully convicted of the crimes Joachim committed.
One man had even made a false confession about killing 16-year-old Manuela Knort, who was in fact murdered by Kroll in 1959.
Der ist zur Polizei nach einiger Zeit gekommen und hat gesagt, ich habe dieses Mädchen umgebracht. Er ist auch dann verurteilt.
After some time, this man went to the police and told them that he killed this girl. He really went to prison for the crime.
As it would turn out, the only reason that this man ever confessed was because he was having money problems and was desperate. He was living on the street at the time. He ended up taking back his confession. He explained to the police in horrifying detail about how he would cut up and mutilate some of his victims, even disposing of the parts that didn't interest him by throwing them down the toilet.
One of the horrifying things of Kroll's crimes was that he took pleasure in taking out the intestines of his victims. And, he'd told a neighbour who was asking him what the smell was. He said rather flippantly, "Oh, it's guts," which it literally was. Intestines. And the neighbor complained.
He was nothing if not brazen, but luckily he would no longer be able to escape the horrible things he had done. He was ultimately charged with 8 murders and 1 attempted murder, despite confessing to 14. His trial was 15 days long, and he was eventually convicted and found guilty on all counts in 1982. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died of a heart attack in 1991 while he was behind bars. If this story made you sick to your stomach, stay tuned for the next one.
Today we are talking about the first known Italian female serial killer, a haunting curse, and a story about making soap that just might turn your stomach.
This woman is Leonarda Cianculi, and she was born in Italy on April 19th of 1894. Leonarda's upbringing was not the best. Beginning way back at the time of her conception, her mother actually got pregnant with her because a man himself on her. At that time, in order to avoid public scrutiny and embarrassment, she had no choice but to marry the same man who did this to her. Leonarda's mother resented her daughter due to how she was conceived and treated her terribly as a result. As you can imagine, Leonarda knew very well that she wasn't wanted, and it made her a very troubled and depressed individual. It was even to the point that she tried to take her own life.
I tried twice to hang myself. Once they came in time to save me, and the other time the rope broke. My mother let me know that she was very sorry to see me alive.
Her family was very poor. Her mother always expected her to marry a rich man when she got older in order to help fix their terrible situation, but Leonarda did not agree. Instead, she ordered an older man who worked as a clerk in an office. Suffice to say, her mother was furious and cursed her for her decision. Her life didn't get much better as she got older. She had many pregnancies, but most of them ended in miscarriage. miscarriages, and others died when they were very young. As a result, she was extremely protective of the 4 children that she had left. In 1939, she was in for a terrible shock when she learned that her beloved oldest son, Giuseppe, was planning to join the army to fight in the Second World War. She was desperate to save him and began looking into the dark world of human sacrifices, and this is what caused her to seek out victims among her neighbors. Her first victim was Faustina Setti. Faustina was a middle-aged woman who had been single all her life. She'd come to Leonarda viewing her as a friend, but she was anything but. Leonarda ended up tricking Faustina and killing her with an axe. What she did next is almost too disgusting to even imagine. She cut up the body and cooked it. She used some of the body to make soap and used other parts to make cakes that she gave out to friends to eat. But she wasn't done there. Her next victim was another middle-aged woman named Francesca Savi. Leonarda passed this victim a glass of drugged wine. When Francesca was inebriated, she killed her and did the same thing with her body that she had done with Faustina's. The third and final victim was that of Virginia Cascipio, a former singer. She killed this older woman in the same manner she had killed the first 2 ladies. Again, she cut up the body, put it in a pot with things like cologne, and made more soap out of it. What was left was turned into cakes. She was quoted as saying, "The cakes too were better. That woman was really sweet." So you're probably wondering, how did this horrific woman ever get caught? It came down to Virginia's sister-in-law becoming suspicious because she knew that Leonarda would have been one of the last people to have seen her alive. She reported her, and Leonarda was taken in for questioning. Now, initially they didn't believe that Leonarda was the killer. They thought that it was her son, Giuseppe. As soon as she knew of their suspicions, she immediately confessed to all of the murders in order to save her beloved son from any blame. Ultimately, she was found guilty of the murders and sentenced to 30 years behind bars and 3 more in a criminal asylum. She never saw the light of day again after dying behind bars in October of 1970. She was 76 years old at the time of her death. She wrote a book while she was incarcerated. These stories so far have been pretty insane, but stay tuned because there's still one left.
In the 80s and 90s, the leafy suburbs of Maryland on America's East Coast was struck by crimes with a truth far stranger than fiction.
It was one of the biggest manhunts in this county's police department history.
The man responsible was Haddon Clark, a cross-dressing killer with an appetite for revenge.
Haddon Clark was born in 1952 in Troy, New York. His early life, like unfortunately many future killers are, was pretty horrific. Both of his parents had drinking problems and argued all the time. He was regularly bullied by other kids, and he lost his father to suicide at a young age. When his mother was drunk, she would often dress him in clothing meant for little girls. This is believed to have had an impact on things he would do later in the future. In order to get back at the kids who bullied him, Haddon would torture and kill their pets. But this was only a slight taste of the evil that he would commit in the future.
I think he a rabbit in front of one of them.
Nothing in Haddon's life ever seemed to go very well. He was in the Navy for a brief time, but ended up being discharged for having paranoid schizophrenia. He was later arrested multiple times for theft.
You could see how somebody like Clark, who is teased, made fun of, bullied, humiliated on a daily or weekly basis, how that can result in an enormous amount of inner anger that's just suppressed.
By May of 1986, things in Haddon's life hadn't much improved. He had just gotten kicked out of his brother's house and was trying to figure out what he was going to do next. It was only by pure opportunity that he killed one of his only known victims, an innocent girl. Michelle Dorr was just 6 years old and was friends with Haddon's niece. She had come by looking for the girl, and Haddon ended up taking her upstairs where he killed her. But that's not the only sick thing he did. He actually drank the child's blood. When he was done with her, he threw her in a duffel bag and dropped it off at a park. She was later reported as missing when she did not return home. The second of his known victims was a 23-year-old woman named Laura Hewlighton. At the time, he had been working as a gardener for Laura's mother, and Laura caught him trying to steal garden tools. He ended up attacking her in her bedroom by stabbing her with a kitchen knife and smothering her with her own pillow. He then buried her in the woods. In order to buy some time, he dressed up in women's clothing pretending to be Laura. He did this so the neighbors would think that Laura had walked away from the scene of the crime. The only problem was that he accidentally left behind a fingerprint on the pillow he used to kill her. This would ultimately be what led the police to him and made it so that they could arrest him. While in for questioning, Hayden acted pretty bizarrely.
Hosanna, Jesus is King. You talk about God, you talk about Jesus and the Lord and your mother and your father. You don't think they're looking down here on you right now? Yeah, they are. And they're saying, Haddon, do what's right.
Hayden would end up confessing to dozens of murders dating back to when he was young. But because of his unstable mental status, it's unclear how many of these actually happened. He was ultimately convicted for murder and sentenced to 70 years behind bars. As of January 2023, he is still alive and behind bars. And so there we have it. 3 horrible and undeniably sick individuals that not only killed people, but actually ate parts of their bodies. In your opinion, which of all these killers committed the most atrocious acts? Let us know in the comments.